So, stories. If you think about your life and the stories that make up your life, the stories that you would count on to explain who you are and how you got to where you are, most of those stories we can only tell with hindsight. You know, we say, well, I knew when this happened and I did this, and now here we are. We have some ability to sort of see our stories and understand them once we're sort of out of that part of the story. And in the stories, we can sometimes tell what's happening a little bit, but there's only a glimmer of something. There's something that draws us into some new way of being, into some new understanding. Some little seed is planted, but it's hard to know exactly where that will take us. And that goes for the commitments we make. For many of us who grew up in the church, when we were 11 or 12 years old, we probably were invited to confirm our faith, to profess for ourselves that we were going to choose to follow Jesus. Not because our parents made us, but because we felt like we had been called and invited into this life and relationship with Jesus. The stories that we tell about what that relationship means and has done and is doing change over time. It's important perspective on stories. I imagine that many of you could tell me lots of ways that you have understood and changed your understanding of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus over time. Sometimes those stories include big and dramatic changes, things that sort of hit us up and we have to make something new with our understanding because life doesn't fit the way it used to. And sometimes the changes and shifts happen slowly and gradually over time until we look back on our story and we realize that we've shifted and that the trajectory has made a big difference. Now, I'm no mathematician, so some of you will know way better than me the technical terminology, but I do know that when a particle, for instance, is moving in a trajectory, if you move it just a degree, it has dramatic effects as that particle continues to move in a changed trajectory. Just like that, faith has the ability to change us, to shift our perspective in such a way that over time we see a dramatic shift in who we have become. At least that's the hope. When Jesus starts teaching these fishermen, these people who had no reason to be heard in the synagogue, these people whose understanding of religion and of God would probably have been downplayed first by them. But Jesus spoke to them and talked to them and taught them about the kingdom of heaven. And because of the things that they understood, because of the things that were planted in their hearts, it changed the trajectory of the world for good. Now, when we think about this, it's important to think about perspective because the way we hear stories depends on where we're sitting. When Theo and I read books together, the perspective is different. Sometimes I may know what the author is trying to get at, and Theo has never read this story before or anything like it. Perspective matters because it changes how we see a story. But it doesn't mean that any perspective is wrong, they're just different. In the reading from 1 Kings, we hear about a young king, Solomon, who in beginning his reign comes to give God a sacrifice. And before he can even make the sacrifice, God speaks to him and says, I will give you one thing. What is it that you want? And Solomon asked for wisdom. That's sort of what we understand. But in one of the commentaries I listened to this week, they said Solomon asked for discernment, for the ability to know the difference between good and evil. It's this discernment which Adam and Eve lacked. They saw the difference between good and evil, but they didn't have the capacity or the wisdom to discern between them, to make a decision about what was right and what was wrong. Solomon's perspective is broadened by his question of God. Please help me to discern. What do we see when we look at the word with a broader lens? What does it ask of us whenever we begin not only to interrogate and work with the story, but also to interrogate where it is we are? From what perspective do we hear this story? And what does it change about what we hear and about what we see that is important in the story we hear? What kind of hindsight does our perspective give us as we hear these stories from Jesus? I've wondered a lot this week about how often I consider my own perspective. In our world right now, we are set up not to share our perspectives and learn as much as we are set up to stand our ground, to dig our feet in, to set down roots, and to be immovable. And in some ways, that seems like a good idea. Because if what we believe and what we know is right, we should not move. But what is it that Jesus has told us over and over again about how the kingdom of heaven works? I think that Jesus is interested in our perspective and also interested in our ability to set our perspective aside and to begin to listen to people who see and understand these stories differently. Because maybe there are lessons for each of us from all of the ways that we see and understand this kingdom of heaven. For instance, today we read 5 parables about the kingdom of heaven. Not one was like the other exactly, but they speak still of the same kingdom. So what is it we are supposed to understand about the kingdom of heaven? I want to draw your attention to the relationships that are apparent in each of these parables. The relationship of us to the story of the mustard seed that becomes a tree. The relationship of that seed to the field. The relationship of us to an amassment of bread. The leaven that is small to 3 measures of flour, which is enough flour to feed about 100 people. The relationship between the treasure that is found and hidden in a field and the wealth of the person who is willing to let all of that go simply to have this field with the treasure in it. The relationship between this pearl of great value and the value of a livelihood of a merchant who sells everything he has to have this pearl of great value. The relationship of fishermen who catch a large catch and who sort through to take the good fish out and throw the bad fish back. It is relationships that seem to be prominent in the kingdom of heaven. It isn't one thing without another. There is something that happens as the two things come together that changes the story. And there are lots of questions about what does it mean. For instance, if you were to plant a seed in your garden, would you plant a bush by your beans and your tomato plants? One that would shade them and shadow them out so that your produce would be limited? Probably not. And yet, the kingdom of heaven is like that seed, which is planted and begins to grow in such a way that it takes over. What about leaven? Why, if you have a family of 4, would you make enough bread for 100? Who would make a decision to do that, and why? Why, if you found a treasure, wouldn't you just keep it and add it to what you had? Why would you bury it and hide it away to go and sell all that you had? Why, if you were a merchant, would you give up any future and livelihood to have one beautiful pearl? Why, if you were a fisherman, wouldn't you have a net that would catch only the fish you wanted to save you the trouble of sorting? The kingdom of heaven is like, Jesus says, it's like this bush that takes over, that grows big and wide. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven in flour that produces more than enough. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden, but when found, it is full of joy for those who know it is there. The kingdom of heaven is like a pearl of great value. It is worth every penny simply to behold. And the kingdom of heaven is the reality that there will be choices that lead us towards the kingdom and choices that lead us away. The kingdom of heaven is unexpected, extravagant, subversive, and worth every penny. The perspective we have on these parables and our understanding of them depends on where we begin to look from and how willing we are to shift our view and see it in another way. When we think about what the kingdom of heaven is like, I often imagine all of the good things in triplicate, 1,000-fold. And I'm not saying that that isn't true, but some of these parables remind me that the kingdom of heaven is also bubbling up. It's also disruptive to the way of life that I hold dear. The kingdom of heaven will ask me to give up all I have and all of who I am for the promise of something better. But I have to ask myself, what am I willing to give up everything for, and why? The questions that Jesus asks through the parables are questions I think that are meant to help us think about what kind of relationship we are willing to have with the kingdom of heaven and with Jesus himself. Are we willing to be challenged in unexpected ways by our commitment to follow this person who heals everyone, who claims the outcast, who seeks out the marginalized, who lifts up not the treasures of the world, but the treasures of love and relationship among people. When we choose to follow Jesus Christ, we make choices every day. Choices to follow Jesus may sometimes feel like small, tangible steps, but those small shifts change our trajectory. Consider for a moment where you started from. When you first heard about Jesus, what did you hear? What was it like? And what have you learned since then that has changed how you live, how you understand things, and how you choose to discover what God is saying now? We proclaim that Jesus Christ is alive in the world, at work in us. That the leaven in the flour is doing something, is changing us, is bringing forth something that can nourish the world in ways that it needs to be nourished. And it is so extravagant, this nourishment and love of God, that it is more than enough. Can you imagine what it would be like to bake bread over and over, simply to give it away? This bread is about more than simply baking a few loaves to get us through the week. The kingdom of heaven is something else entirely. And sometimes the challenge of faith is to allow ourselves to shift perspective so we can see it. To ask questions about where we stand and why we stand here. About what we hear and what we don't. And I wonder, in this world where perspective is so rigid for so many of us, I stand here and you stand there, and there's no place where we meet in between. But in the kingdom of heaven, I wonder if it isn't so clear-cut. In the kingdom of heaven, is there not room for a different perspective, for a conversation and a relationship, to respond to something that comes up unexpectedly between us, that invites us both to move? So that we share not only our perspectives with one another, but so that we begin to see a perspective that is not of our making, a perspective that is of God's creation. When we look at our world and at the opportunities to share love and to proclaim salvation, to live into resurrection, I invite you to think about how you see the world, and to think about how you might open your perspective and broaden it so that your discernment can be more in line with God's. For God sees and understands more than we can ever know. But if we choose to open ourselves to God's wisdom, we may just be able to discern more fully how the kingdom of God is being birthed in our world today, and how God is inviting us to contribute with our hands and our feet and our hearts and our minds to building up this place, this way, this life that is worth every penny. Amen. As we gather, even digitally, we come together with prayers and concerns, with joys and sorrows. We come to a